Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning into this video as part of the International Congress of Conservation Biology 2021. In this video, I will explain a simple method to incorporate monitoring in conservation planning and decision making with a specific application to two case studies of endangered species management in two very different systems across the globe. In conservation planning, one thing we always have to contend with is uncertainty. Now, there is uncertainty in how a system works. Perhaps we don't know it well enough. Perhaps we don't know what it will do in the future. It's inherently stochastic. And very often we also don't know which actions will work, whether they will work, and how. And so we don't know which decisions we should make. What's the best action to implement? Should we do something at all? To solve this conundrum at the moment of making a decision, we typically turn, as good scientists do, to learning. So we say we should monitor the system, so perhaps learn a little bit longer about how it works. But also, often we think we should implement actions, monitor their outcomes, and learn which ones work and which ones don't. So the next time we'll have to make a decision, we'll be more informed, and ultimately the outcome will be better. Often, the learning is very rigorous and scientific, but there is a weak link at the time of turning that learning into action. This is a big implementation gap that is well known for adaptive management. And that is because learning is not just about a scientific process, it's also about money. Monitoring takes time, takes resources, takes effort, and just monitoring things for longer and in more detail is not necessarily the best thing to do if it provides information that is not useful, for example. There are ways of finding optimal solutions to this problem, like optimal adaptive management, but often they can be complicated. They can be a bit of black box if you're not a mathematician, and sometimes, because they're computationally intensive, to make them work on a computer, we have to simplify the management problem a lot. And this can lose realism, perhaps fail to engage with managers and other scientists, and at the same time, basically, we are not optimizing the problem that we are truly facing. So it might not be as useful as we hoped it could be. So the solution that is an alternative to optimization or to not doing any sort of integration of learning into planning is based on simulation. We commonly use simulations in conservation, for example. Think about population viability analysis, where we take some knowledge that we have, some priors, as we call them, and we use them to populate a model and then use that model to project into the future. For example, what a population will do, its fluctuations, its stochasticity, its probability of going extinct, that type of biological process. Now, the suggestion here is that we could simulate not only the biological process, but also the whole learning process. So we take our priors, we simulate what, for example, a population will do, but we also simulate how we could collect data about that population. For example, if there are 100 birds out there, how many could we expect to count, given some sort of imperfect detection? How would we analyze those data? For example, could we fit a microcapture model, a reciting model, a state space model, and other types of analysis? And then we could also simulate decisions. So for example, rules like if we estimate there are fewer than 100 birds, we want to provide some extra food. If we estimate there are more than 100 birds, but perhaps we can open hunting. Something like this, where to an estimate corresponds a decision. We can simulate all these things together, and then we can iterate the process through time again and again and again. And in this way, we can simulate essentially whole biological monitoring, analysis, updating knowledge, and decision process. And this can be really useful when we need to choose which monitoring we should do. I'll present two case studies. One is very simple. It's a very small project that we did a few years back on this yellow-bellied toad in Italy. This was just 4 years. We had very little money, and the idea was that we wanted to establish a new population of toads by harvesting some eggs or tadpoles from an existing population. and either maybe breeding them in captivity or head starting the tadpoles or just moving eggs to one place to the other. And one other objective that we had was to minimize impact on the source. And so what we did was basically build a very simple population model with just a few life stages, fit to simulated data, a very simple count model, basically binomial confidence interval. And then we fitted and we coded some very simple decision rules that reflected the things that we wanted to achieve, our objectives of minimizing impact to the source and maximizing translocation success on the basis of the returns of the model. So if the model, the binomial confidence interval for population at the destination and recruitment at the source gave us certain estimates, we would decide one thing or the other. For example, if the model estimated that the recruitment dropped below what is considered a reasonable natural variability, then at the source, then we would discontinue harvesting. If the recruitment was considered satisfactory, so we could go on reharvesting, then we would take the estimates of translocation success to decide which method was more suitable, and so which one we should keep and which ones we should discard. And these decision rules are coded as basically if-else statements. Now we implemented this suggestions of the simulation by captive breeding or harvesting animals, marking them for release, actually release them at the destination site, and then monitoring the outcomes. And this is what happened. For some parameters, we found out that the priors were actually not great. So our initial guesses were not perfect, but as the simulation suggested, with monitoring we were able to narrow our uncertainty quickly and find out where we were wrong, and instead on which parameters we were actually quite close to the truth and were reliable estimates from the beginning. And also which parameters we could not learn at all, just because perhaps a certain life stage could not be observed in nature. So ultimately, the translocation was not so successful, so we were at the lower end of our initial guesses, and so it just didn't go that well because samples and numbers were very small. But as predicted by the simulation, recruitment remained high, and so harvest did not have a massive impact. And the simulation helped us predict this and made us confident that not only would have little impact, but we would quickly be able to understand if we did, and therefore, if needed, discontinue our harvest. So in this sense, the simulation helped us achieve our first objective. In the second case study, we dealt with different species, a bird species, a hihi that occurs in 10, I think more or less, sites in New Zealand, and is quite intensively managed at those sites. Every year, birds are fed, given supplementary feeding where the habitat is not good enough to support them. Birds are harvested, they are taken and translocated to other sites to boost existing population, declining ones, and they are monitored intensively. And every year we have to make lots of decisions, whether to feed, whether to monitor, whether to translocate, and these decisions have always been made at the site level. But we wanted to scale up this program, to have a one single overarching decision-making framework, so that decisions made at one site would benefit, for example, from learning made at other sites. And so what we did was fit a very large, in this case, simulation, so enormous compared to the little yellow-bellied toad one that I just presented, where we had each site had its own population model. Then we had simulated bird counts in the way that are actually carried out every year. Then we fitted state space models to estimate things like population size, carrying capacity with and without feeding, post-release mortality, detection probabilities, variability in growth rates, for example, and estimating these things, we would then move to decision rules, which again were if-else statements. But in this case, were very complex, multiple pages of code based on the size of the population, the estimated carrying capacity, the estimated trend, the estimated effect of feeding. We could decide, for example, to harvest or translocate more individuals or to discontinue feeding. And some were very conservative, so they chose to forego learning, for example, always feed size to make sure that we have lots of birds. Others were aggressive, so cost-focused, where we didn't want to spend much money, so we just never fed. And others tried to strike a balance and, for example, maybe take away food where populations seem to do well, to learn about the effect of feeding, and then hopefully improve other decisions. And if needed, we could always restart the feeding. So all these things were coded as if complex if-else statements were based on the estimates that we got from the model. The simulation would make a certain decision. And the decision then influences what happens in the next time step. If we feed, carrying capacity will go up. The results are in a way expected and in a way very informative, because there are bird-focused, so conservative strategies that provide lots of birds but cost lots of money. There are aggressive or cost-focused strategies that save lots of money but sacrifice many birds. And others that use learning as an integrated part of management manage to strike a balance. And so, for example, they can still, by learning from actions, you can still save money and produce enough birds. And so we can take into account multiple objectives like visitors to size, the level of wilderness of a population, for example, prefer to feed less than feeding more, and so all these things can be tracked in a simulation. We'll still have to make a decision. So the advantages of this method that I've just illustrated are multiple. First of all, we use in a simulation tools that we already use routinely, like PVAs, like estimation models, bird counts to estimate population sizes. These are things that we already encountered and many of us use. But by putting them on paper before we make a decision, it forces us to highlight the limitations of learning. For example, on one hand, for example, in the Hihi case, we learned that the samples, the population sizes remain so small that learning is anyway quite limited. There is a lot of uncertainty. On the other hand, having the decision rules, those if-else statements written down, helps us be clear and avoid, for example, knee-jerk reactions or instinctive responses to data that have just come in where something looks like it doesn't work, and then we react in a sort of trial and error way that can actually be quite biased. And by providing this realism, we connect better with the actual management program. So, for example, with other scientists or managers, and it's not a black box that people have to trust blindly. You actually see what's happening because there are tools that we already know. So it's not an optimal solution, but we hope and we find that in general, in these and other case studies, it's a good approximation to that optimal solution that would be very hard to obtain exactly with purpose-built code. So I hope this stimulated your interest, and some of these case studies have been published already, others are coming, and there are many more. But for now, I would just like to thank the collaborators and, of course, the funders, and most of all, you for listening. Thank you.